there is this moment, perhaps you've heard of or seen it in home improvement shows. How many watch home improvement shows? I'm an addict. It's called The Reveal. The Reveal. It's when one or two or more homeowners who have agreed to have their home redone by typically a team are brought back to their now newly renovated house and for the first time get to see the finished product. There's even one little team, a certain team from the southern part of the United States that actually paints what the old house used to look like from the outside on panels so that the couple or whoever it is brought and they first can't see the newly renovated house. And as they stand there, they take the panels away so that it's this big reveal. I have to confess, I never get tired of looking at what happens at the reveal, for the experience is always powerful. Shouts, astonishment, and tears, typically tears, not just on account of the granite countertops in the kitchen or a new and more beautiful and functional bathroom. And oh, by the way, I had the big reveal in your bathroom because I had seen the ones before. And I didn't cry, but I almost did. So it's not just about those physical changes. No, rightly or wrongly, you may take issue with this, the emotional response has to do with people getting a new vision of the kind of life their family and they can now enjoy. Just through knocking down some walls, repainting some rooms, replacing kitchen cabinets and appliances, and creating spaces that just work better. Often that allow people to be together more. That's what I've noticed as the theme, the open concept everything, so we can never get away from each other. It's great. In a strange sort of way, this is what the story of the Transfiguration is really all about. A group of disciples who get to see the big reveal of sorts. Let me say a little more. And I'm just going to kind of go through the story again. It's well known to you. Just as in the other Gospels, in Matthew's Gospel, the disciples are, pretty clueless, and can you blame them? Yes, they've thrown their lot in with Jesus, but when it comes down to it, they're confused about who he is and anxious about what following him will really mean. And so Jesus tries to help them out, tells them stories, demonstrates through his actions of healing and other things about what he's about, periodically sends them out to do things in his name, and from time to time says things directly to them about what his ministry will include. And he's just done that actually in Matthew. And we get it in this gospel passage. Which begins with 6 days after he's kind of told Peter and therefore the others who he really is, that is, he's going to suffer and die and be raised again. That's when this happens. So in this story, one day he invites a small group of them to go up to the mountain to pray. Mountains, of course, being places in Jewish history where important kind of reveals of God take place. And while Jesus is praying, that is, while Jesus is communing with God, something strange happens. His face changes and his clothes become dazzling white. Then, right there, Moses and Elijah show up and speak to Jesus about his departure in Jerusalem, that is, about, again, his crucifixion and death. The disciples are there, hearing all this, seeing all this. Just as Moses and Elijah are going back to wherever they came from, Peter has his own renovation idea in mind. He's a construction guy, right? He offers to construct 3 booths to house the experience, so to speak. But as he's speaking of this, a terrifying cloud, a bright cloud, engulfs them, out of which God's voice comes to redirect the focus away from somehow housing the experience to where their attention actually belongs, on Jesus. This is my son, he says, God says, my chosen one, listen to him. At this, the disciples are overcome by fear and fall to the ground. The cloud then dissipates, and Jesus alone is before them. Jesus tells them not to be afraid and to get back up. They then all go down the mountain and tell no one what they've seen. About this event, the author Madeleine L'Engle once wrote, and this is so beautiful, suddenly they saw him the way he was, the way he really was all the time, although they'd never seen it before. He was radiant, brilliant, carrying joy like a flaming sun in his hands. Suddenly they saw him the way he was, the way he really was, all the time. Although they'd never seen it before, he was radiant, brilliant, carrying joy like a flaming sun in his hands. In other words, what they witnessed was a reveal, a look at who he really was and what he'd really come to offer them and all of humanity, though it would cost him dearly. Joy like a flaming sun in his hands. Joy that cannot be housed as a way to hold on to it, but must be released, must be taken back out into the world. That mountaintop experience must have given the disciples the kind of certainty, at least for a while, that they've been craving in the midst of all the confusing ups and downs with Jesus, all their trouble with religious authorities, all their wondering, what is it he's really saying, all their anxiety about what it would mean for their lives, which of course brings us to you and me here today. Just like the disciples, you and I, at least I do, I want a greater sense of certainty about who Jesus is and what Jesus is really inviting, asking, commanding, urging, nudging me to do. You and I, we crave more encouragement, more certainty as we try to piece out what it means for us to follow Jesus in a world lived very much not on the mountaintop, but down in the reality of our lives. Some of us have mountaintop experiences. We have them in prayer. We have them in worship. We have them as God seems to break through to us. But most people I talk to don't refer to their mountaintop experiences. They're more talking about their anxiety, their lack of certainty as they live their lives, not on the mountaintop, but down in today's world. And so what we have then is this beautiful story that kind of we want to touch and want to know what it might be suggesting to us about not just what the disciples experienced, but what we might take away as a help to live here and now off that mountaintop. So I was telling our chaplain, Steve Black, earlier before we started, I said, I'm going to preach about something that I don't usually preach about. Because I'm a kind of, what some preachers do with this subject is talk about the human capacity for being that person who carries joy like a flaming sun in our hands. And isn't it beautiful? Each of us can carry joy, even if we've had a hard day, like a flaming sun in our hands. But actually, I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about a different thing, about a couple of things this story might be suggesting or even kind of revealing to us. And here's the first one. We, you and I, are not God. On the mountaintop, the little group of disciples got to glimpse the mystery the power and the glory of God in an experience that was for them a bit like looking into the eye of the universe itself. This was so overwhelming that, as Matthew says, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. In other words, they encountered something so large, so powerful, so other, that it knocked them off their feet, literally. They encountered the great distance between their capacities and power and God's capacities and power. They encountered a joy so stunning, a capacity for relationships so large, a dignity so immense that it overwhelmed them. And so just as the disciples discovered, we are not God. Though created in the image of God, we are not God. Though we have many potentials, we are not the realization of every potential. We do not understand all things. We do not know the ultimate truth about a situation, about a person, or even about ourselves. We are limited in knowledge, in power, and in energy. In all things, our purview and our judgments are based on what is partial and what is finite. So finitude is essential to the human condition. What this means then is that we are to hold our judgments, our understanding, and even our actions in a provisional way. We are to stand ready to learn more, to forgive more, to be more open to revise our perspectives, our judgments, and yes, our plans. We are not God. And for me, today, in the world we live in, my friends, this is good news. This is great news for me. The second thing I believe our story reveals is this. Though we are not God, we have been told to rise up, to stand on our feet, to abandon the fears that would paralyze us, and to go back down the mountain to follow Jesus there. We are to rise up, to stand up, to fear not, or at least to park the fear. Don't let the fear paralyze us. In the Transfiguration story, after the group of disciples have fallen to the ground in awe and fear, the text says that Jesus touches them. I was wondering how many times in Scripture Jesus touches somebody. It's relatively few. More people are touching him than he's touching. But the text says he touches them and tells them, get up and do not be afraid. In other words, don't let your experience of God's power or your experience of your own limitations or the world's craziness paralyze you and keep you from acting. And so while we're holding our judgments, our understandings, and our actions in a provisional way, we cannot let fear paralyze us or worrying that we're going to make a big mistake. We are not to be paralyzed by what we don't know, by what might happen, by the many limitations we live with, or by the size of the challenges we perceive around us. We are asked to get up and put one foot in front of the other, trusting that God will be along with us along the way. And so in a sense, we're told to say our prayers and do our best, to get up, to stick together, and to get on with it as we live our lives as individuals and as communities of faith down the mountain. And oh, let's not forget that if Madeline Lingle is right, joy is at the center of what Jesus came to bring us, joy as radiant as the sun. So today we have a reaffirmation of faith. And today is also the last Sunday of the season following the Epiphany, the Sunday right before Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent, a time of introspection and preparation for Holy Week and Easter. And so today especially, as we support people reaffirming their faith, and as we are on the cusp of a new leg of our journey, people of All Saints, remember the story of the Transfiguration and what it reveals to us. Remember to hold your life and your judgments and your conclusions in a provisional way, trusting that God will reveal more to you along the way. And remember this, God is touching you, asking you to rise up, telling you to abandon your fears and to move forward. For the one who comes carrying joy like a flaming sun is in his hands, the one who touches us and tells us not to be afraid, the one who raises us up, needs us to follow him into the world and for the sake of the world.